Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we've got a very special guest, Rich Yeselson, who is a former labor organizer, writer, scholar of labor history and other things. Anything I'm missing there, Rich?
I got to correct you because actually the real organizers get annoyed. I wasn't a labor organizer. I was what they call a strategic campaigner, doing, corporate campaigns. I actually sort of discussed that a bit in the first part of my recent Nation Review essay. But, there's some overlap, but not quite the same thing.
Yeah. So, for us union rubes, newbies who aren't familiar with the lingo, sort of labor organizing adjacent related program activities, you might say.
Sure.
And yeah, so I thought, I got a few questions here where we could maybe start the discussion with this article in The Nation, which we'll link in the description. But it's a review of Eric Loomis's new book. I didn't write down. What's the name of it, Rich?
A History of America in 10 Strikes.
That's it.
Yeah. So you got this great review of his book, which talks about, the sort of the history of the labor movement. But one thing it starts with is this very wild story of your own, this one instance of trying to beat this just terrible boss of from one of the aluminum baron, Mark Rich, right?
Right.
Yeah. So later pardoned by Bill Clinton, funnily enough.
Right.
So
outrageously.
If you could tell sort of the highlights of that story, there's like attempted murder, there's this financial shenanigans, James Bond stuff. Yeah,
it was actually pretty incredible. But it also speaks to a particular moment in the trajectory of the American labor movement too. I mean, the gist of it is, as I was saying before, I was sort of part of this, what I call in the piece, like this newish paradigm called comprehensive campaigns. Some people earlier called it corporate campaigns. And the reason that comprehensive campaigns even became like a thing in the labor movement was precisely to compensate for the decline in membership and correspondingly the decline in rank and file energy, maybe militancy. Or you might, in fairness to rank and file, you might say the inability of labor to figure out how to organize on scale and also how to defend the contracts they had. So the way that was done was you didn't just stay within the paradigm of labor stuff or labor law. Like you didn't just walk around with a picket sign, or you didn't just go to the bargaining table to demand your rights. You saw the company as a unified, organic adversary, and you tried to, effectively analyze as well as any sort of, Goldman Sachs analyst, as well as you could, the company's whole business model, and then you would leverage the business model, not just your rank and file strength on the shop floor. You'd leverage the business model in order to, actually then go back to your goal as a union, which was either to organize a new shop or to defend the contract of an old shop. So the Ravenswood case is an aluminum facility. Actually, for a while, it made the aluminum for about 65% of like the canned beer and soda in the country. So it was a big shop in Ravenswood, West Virginia. It was controlled, although not owned, by this almost James Bondian character, Mark Rich, whose nickname was Aluminum Finger, because he basically controlled, the largest segment of the world aluminum market and the world bauxite market. You can't make aluminum without bauxite. he also, it wasn't just aluminum. It was anything metal the guy traded. He is a multi-billionaire. One of the most gratifying parts of the whole campaign, I'll say parenthetically, I didn't say this didn't have, space to say everything in the piece, was at one point Forbes called us in our little labor shop and said, so yeah, hi, we know you've been working on researching Mark Rich, and we're trying to figure out what his net worth is, for the Forbes 400 list. And, so I just wondered, what do you think? What would you estimate his net worth is? I said, what? Forbes? Aren't you guys known as the capitalist tool? You're calling three union researchers to see what the net worth of one of the biggest plutocrats on earth is, I mean, it was incredible. It was incredibly gratifying. I mean, and we may well have had a better idea than he did. A lot of stuff was hidden, but it was wonderful.
Sure.
So anyway, basically, long story short here. So Rich controlled this place through a bunch of cutouts. And, in other words, he wasn't involved in the local management. There was another guy who the workers called Rat Face, who was literally the rat face of management, and they hated him. But behind all this is this guy, Mark Rich, and where is he? He's in Zug, Switzerland. Well, I thought he was an American. Well, he is an American, but he had fled the United States jurisdiction, in the early 1980s, with a not a suitcase. What do they call those things? A trunk, a massive trunk full of documents. I mean, this is pre-internet. This is all hard copy stuff, right? So wow. Massive trunk full of stuff, because the U.S. Attorney Southern District, then headed by none other than Rudolph Giuliani, accused him of what was then the largest tax evasion case in United States history, something like $250 million. Where he was also accused of, trading, violating sanctions with South Africa, sanctions with Iran. I mean, a whole bunch of stuff. So he takes off for Switzerland, which of course has a very lenient view of financial crimes. And he's got all kinds of stuff buried all over the place, but he's still controlling stuff in the United States, as we discovered. And so the gist of this is, it's an incredible campaign. It lasts a little under 2 years. We chase this guy all over the world. I mean, we map out his stuff all over the world, his interests. We stop him from doing a big deal to buy the state-owned aluminum industry in the now, Eastern Europe liberated Czechoslovakia, what was then Czechoslovakia, then later, of course, then split up again. We stop him from actually still doing a deal with the U.S. Mint in the United States, where this fugitive from American justice is selling copper and nickel to the U.S. Mint. So, that seemed kind of, I don't know, un-American or something. I don't know. So, but we nailed him on that. And then, Tom Brokaw said it on the nightly NBC News one night. It was great. Anyway, and workers are, as much involved in this as possible. This is a steelworkers union, and they spend as much money as they can to send workers all over the world. Bucharest, Romania had a huge hotel there. Amsterdam, this place, that place, and it was scary in that our research revealed that he was an incredibly ruthless guy who would not stop from killing people. In fact, his former PR person said, "Do not go to Jamaica," which is a place we thought about going and we would joke about because, the weather's so great. But he said, Mark can have you killed for $100 there in Kingston. So, okay.
Jesus.
Then this other guy, Matty Huananti, who was a business rival of Rich, who had become a source for us and was a world-class skier. He was a Finn. I mean, so he was skiing 11 months a year or whatever. So he barely survived a hit-and-run attack on a ski slope, which, this guy doesn't get hurt on ski slopes. He was great. His neck was broken, though, and he was in critical condition. He survived it. Pretty much everybody on the campaign thinks that was an attempted murder. And it went on and on, but we win, okay? I mean, I could go on. There are so many stories, a lot of them aren't in print, but the upshot is we win the campaign after 20 months. We get the workers, all 1,700 workers, get back their job. It becomes kind of a, to some extent, a national story. It's in Eric Loomis's book, which gave me the lead to sort of like talk about it myself. He's got a paragraph in his book. That's all great. Rich himself, concedes defeat, has the president, the vice president, the steel workers come to his chalet or something, his lawyer was Leonard Garment, who was Nixon's general counsel, and we get the last laugh on him too. And that was great. And, a great book about it was written by two academics, called Ravenswood. But for me, and the lead into the piece is, these tactics or this whole strategic paradigm, we could do incredible things with it. You threw incredible amount of resources, both human and financial resources, into it, and spent 2 years figuring all this stuff out. And personally, it was obviously gratifying and really was crazy and exciting. But as a model to rebuild labor, you couldn't do this stuff on scale. So it wasn't like, oh, this was the turning point for labor. It was like, yeah, union density kept going down. I mean, there were other great campaigns that, lots of people have done. Obviously SEIU, Justice for Janitors, and another example of these kind of comprehensive campaigns. But the numbers keep going down. And somehow there's nothing yet that can replace just the sheer mass mobilization of workers withdrawing their labor when they have a mind to, as opposed to this incredibly, ingenious stuff that we were doing to sort of compensate for that.
Right. Yeah, that makes good sense. There's so many good things in the review that you wrote, Rich. It seems to me that one of the themes is the difficulties that arise in growing the labor movement, or just in lefty politics generally, have to do with the extent to which there needs to be unity, and that's very difficult to do. So you need, as Eric Loomis argues, the state to have people that are willing to work with labor and to help. Unions aren't strong enough without people in government to work with them and that are on their side. And that conflicts with other problems, because within the left and electorally within the Democratic Party, right, you have other conflicts that, you touched on about race and intersectionality. So there has to be unity, and yet there are all these conflicts that threaten that unity. So what are some thoughts you have about the future of unions and the future of the left generally in trying to have a united front in power that's effective amidst all this kind of internecine struggle?
Well, this is obviously a classic and a very old question. And in fact, just in terms of, labor history and labor studies, labor theory, across disciplines, this is still a controversial thing, because a lot of people have argued in the past, not without reason, that the more that the state, any state, gets involved in the labor movement, the more bureaucratic it becomes. The less likely it is to respond to the energy of the rank and file. I mean, this is a classic criticism of the kind of new left scholars that emerged after the 60s, new left labor people, Mike Davis, Kim Moody, people like that. And there's something to it. The trouble is, especially, although not only, I would say, in the United States, among the so-called advanced democratic or advanced capitalist countries, is that, if you just leave it to an arm wrestle between labor and capital, like the way the general counsel of the AFL-CIO, and then subsequently Secretary of Labor, and then subsequently Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg wished in the 1950s, when labor was at its strongest, labor usually loses, just because, in the actually existing history as it plays out, the corporations are stronger. And then they get a thumb get put on the scale on their behalf by the state too. So labor has to somehow, whether it's in some countries, whether it's through an explicit labor party or social democratic party, whether it's through a rejuvenated democratic party in this country, allowing for like the various kinds of dynamics of race, class, and gender, labor has to have like the state at least say, you are, and this is, we're a long way from socialism here, or some way, but you are at least as a foundational axiom, you are a quotidian, love that word, part of liberal democratic capitalism. Like unions are as much part of what we do here in the United States, for example, as corporations are, or universities are, or podcasts are, and we'll show that small capital, petty bourgeois capital, and so we're going to validate that. And sort of it appeared to some people at the time that around the time of the National Labor Relations Act, and then into World War II, which was its own set of unique circumstances, that labor had established that, okay, unions are just part of the mix. It's like Dwight Eisenhower, not, a Republican, spoke before the AFL convention, before the AFL and CIO was merged in 1952 when he was running for president, subsequently won, and said, I'm paraphrasing now because I can't remember the exact quote, but it was a very strong quote. It basically said anybody who thinks that unions just aren't part of the mix now and going forward is just some, reactionary throwback. I mean, we're not even talking about that anymore. It should just, you have your weighted existence here in our political culture and in our political economy. And so Loomis, in his fine book, kind of pounds that point, like to get back to like the argument in the book itself, or the way the argument is structured, like the 10 strikes. So you have a chapter basically based around labor actions, and then he builds out from there to it becomes the political economy of the entire country and the building of capitalist democracy in the United States. And at the end of it, almost every chapter, Loomis will sort of get to a point where he'll say, and this strike, this labor action, or this set of labor actions, because he sort of digresses into many more strikes than just 10, which is to the book's advantage. They either succeeded or failed because the state stepped in, either to help labor, as TR did in the coal strike in the early 1900s, which really the first president to really explicitly kind of say, okay, let's fix this, guys, and you're not going to crush the union, big deal. Obviously FDR did many times on labor's side, et cetera. But obviously also then you have it the other way, like Reagan sort of stepping in, not just stepping in, but explicitly crushing the air traffic controllers, et cetera, et cetera. So basically almost every chapter he says, look, if labor doesn't have the state on its side, it loses, or at least the odds are really high. So I just get back to thinking, maybe I lack the political imagination or the social imaginary, as the theorists say, but I just can't figure out how to get unions, at least at an initial step here in the U.S. and indeed in other advanced countries, to a point where they have more power and more weight unless the state is on their side. The trick, though, and I'm just going to add this, I know I'm carrying on, but the trick is that at the point when unions need that help from the state most, definitionally, they are at their weakest. Otherwise, they wouldn't ask for the help, Mm-hmm. So, like now, like unions beg, please help us, whoever is the Democratic president or the Democratic Congress or whatever. Please help us. Some Democrats actually, I would say, argue more these days than ever than in many, many years, which is a fascinating paradox. But the fact is that labor is asking for help from a position of weakness now with union density down, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my answer there.
Wouldn't it make sense then, because I note in your piece you also speak to the Green New Deal and how labor, at least part of labor, isn't supporting it for whatever reason. It occurs to me that insofar as the neoliberal wing that has arisen in the Democratic Party has eaten away and worked against the interests of unions and labor, it seems strange to not try to, for unions not to try to ally themselves more with the kind of Soc Dem, Dem Soc wing, who might actually help them when they're at their weakest out of principle, right? As opposed to those that are seeking more of a quid pro quo in the neoliberal wing. So can you help me understand why they're doing that, other than maybe the myopia, right, of just looking out for their union rather than unions interconnected?
Well, your last point is obviously part of it. And let's be clear. I think there's going to be some of the more progressive unions, and already do, like SEIU, I'm sure has connections with, say, DSA in places. But there's a lot of things going on here, and it becomes an incredibly complicated dance. Like, if you look at the Green New Deal, first of all, yes, labor itself is so heterogeneous in terms of, like, sectors of the economy, public versus private, sort of old line building trade unions versus manufacturing unions versus service unions, again, versus state unions, that it doesn't have, it would be nice to think it does, but in reality, it doesn't have a universal principle of solidarity. In fact, that's part of the reason that PATCO lost their strike in 1981, because the airline pilots, who had a lot of leverage, they didn't want to go with PATCO. In fact, PATCO itself, was so smug that they endorsed Reagan in 1980. Who's the villains here? The machinists, who were headed then by a self-proclaimed, as the phrase goes, socialist, William Winterspesinger, and a member of DSA. When push came to shove, he didn't want to join their strike either, because he thought they were going to lose. So you've got a lot of different interests. And some of these unions just think, wow, we're just going to lose jobs here. Right, as you say, we're just calculating that we're just going to lose jobs. On the other hand, when labor is weak, as it generally is now, it does try to expand its sort of template and make connections. This AFL-CIO, for example, and certainly SCIU, which is not in the AFL-CIO currently, does reach out to other progressive groups, does reach out to feminist groups, to African American civil rights groups, to immigration activist reform groups. Now you ask, but right, what about the self-proclaimed, like that, as the phrase used to be known, the self-proclaimed socialist, DSA? What about Bernie Sanders? And this is where I would say to you that another part of the dynamic here, including what's going on with the Green New Deal, the initial sort of, lukewarm or worse remarks of some labor leaders toward it, is that unions are small c conservative. I worked in the labor movement for like 24 years, and sometimes, leftists who are frankly, usually themselves independent contractors, right? I mean, they're either writers or academics. A history or sociology department in a university is just, what is that but 25 independent contractors who share the same floor of offices? They're all doing their own separate research, et cetera, et cetera. And, unions are very much not independent contracting thinkers. And they're very worried about, for good reason, about being beaten badly, busted. Days of jailing most union leaders, hasn't had that in a while, but even large fines. So, like, an example, back in the 80s, like the co-writer of the famous Port Huron statement, founder of SDS, Tom Hayden, who was still pretty much a lefty then, and he was for the rest of his life, ran for mayor of Los Angeles, and pretty much every union, including the progressive unions, endorsed the incumbent, who was like a sort of not insane, kind of like business friendly, but not rabidly libertarian Republican named Tom Reardon. And you think that's crazy. How did they, how could they not endorse the lefty, And you have a good argument. Their argument is because we think actually that guy, the lefty, isn't going to win, and we want to have some weight with this guy who actually does do business with us and doesn't try to destroy us. Now, I'm not asking you to accept that. I'm asking you just to sort of understand it as an analytical point. That
sure.
There were same thing in Chicago with Rahm. Some unions obviously broke from him, famously the teachers union, a few others, but others stayed with him, So part of the problem with, and I think, this is a very soft prediction, or at least something to look for. It'll be interesting to see what unions across the board do vis-a-vis the Sanders candidacy going forward. A lot of them, and probably even the most progressive ones, are going to be calculating things beside like who is the guy most, on their side. Like when Sherrod Brown left the race, they lost like a good sort of still, liberal, populist Democrat who doesn't call himself a socialist. A lot of these unions now are going to be afraid. Again, I'm not, justifying this, but I'm saying they're going to be afraid if they're labeled socialist too. They're also just going to be calculating, okay, can he win? Can he win? Now, obviously, we all fail in our punditry. They were calculating in 2016 too, and they picked the person they were sure. Frankly, all of them, SEIU, all the rest of them, picked the person they were sure was not only going to win the nomination but win the presidency, Hillary Clinton. Not because she had great union bona fides. I mean, she was saying all the right things, she has for years, but because they said, "Look, why do we want to piss off the winner? She is going to be president of the United States. We're on her side." But they got that wrong, as did obviously many other pundits from left to right. So the punditry might be wrong. The anxiety about being linked to a socialist might be craven, or whatever you want to say. But these are real considerations, and I'm not saying I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be interesting to see because of that small C dynamic. And to some extent, even a larger C dynamic in the American labor movement, since post-war period. So, yeah.
This may be one more question on union organizing. So, I think you described well this situation and how I would characterize it as tactical caution that is sort of shaded into timidity. It's like you're just being nipped away another percent here, another percent here, and you've gone from 35% union density to 7%, and you're still just going, well, what if we lose? And it's like, come on, dude, get some chips and just push them onto something, because there's going to be not a single person left in the whole private sector, as you say. What about there's those periods in history, like 1930s under what's his name, Big Bill Haywood or whatever, when there were just sudden explosions of union organizing and like whole sectors of the economy being organized in a matter of months or years. And like what type of situation is that? What are those people thinking at that time?
Well, that's a great question, obviously. And another point to make about union growth is when you look at, and this is not just in the United States, but again, in the advanced countries, there's a correlation here. When you look at the way unions grow, in modern history, and will date modern history since around 1880 or so, 1890. They grow in in the United States and pretty much elsewhere. They grow in big chunks, or they don't grow at all.
Yeah.
They either decline or stay flat. So what is going on with the big chunks? With the big chunks means they either grow during a massive economic dislocation, like the Great Depression, the 1930s, or they grow under the controlled economy and the statist, again, the state, the importance of the state, the statist imperative for full production of a war, and a big war, not just, obviously.
Full mobilization.
Yeah, right. I'm not talking about regional wars. I'm talking about World War II and also World War I, for that matter, where labor came out of that incredibly strongly.
There's a great. I was just reading this Politico reprint of an article from 1944 when FDR sent the troops into Montgomery Ward to pull the CEO out because he wouldn't accept the NLRB negotiated settlement with the union, and it was like they literally carried him out like he was a baby. It's like.
They literally did, and he was he was a particular. I wouldn't say, he was extreme both in his affect and like just not wanting to make the deal at all. I mean, the deal, going back to that FDR cut with, with labor, and corporate America writ large, just shortly after Pearl Harbor, was really basically a good deal for both sides, but both sides broke through and pushed at it and chafed at it. I mean, basically the deal was to the companies, hey, you're going to get 24/7 production because we need every goddamn thing you make. We need the bullets, the bombs, the uniforms. We need food. We need shoes. We need a centralized, pretty much planned economy with everybody working, which is why on VE Day or VJ Day, correct me, the measured unemployment rate was 1.2%. I would not, I would say that's just, like they were out there, that 1%, but that's just pretty damn close to full employment. So it was a good deal for the companies because 24/7, high, ratcheting up productivity made them a hell of a lot of money. The deal for the unions was, okay, so your guys work 24/7, but anywhere you want to have a union, your union's just going to be, it's going to be certified. These companies are going to accept it because we can't deal with any strikes. You're going to get regular raises. They're not, you're going to work. Your guys are going to work hard, but they're going to get regular raises. You as labor institutions are going to have constant growth, which is why 4+ million more union members came on board in a country of 120 million during World War II. Maybe a little more. My figures are merging in my head these days, but. So that was a good deal from both sides, but both sides pushed it. And sometimes the company said, no, we hate unions. We don't want a union, like Montgomery Ward. And then Roosevelt busted hard on them. And sometimes, like John L. Lewis would go out in the coal mines and say, no, actually, we're not making enough money. And that was when, coal represented 65% of America's energy needs. And he could pull out 400,000 people and, turn off the lights. So both sides had their push. But what happened in the 30s, and again, it's incredible to think because the 20s were terrible for unions, but, basically they were busted hard after World War I. They were red baited. The membership declined to about, 10% of the non-farm workforce at the time of the Depression. But what happened was, there were shoots and seeds of militancy that had sustained itself in the post-World War I period. failure of 350,000 steel workers to organize a national steel union in 1919. Well, they lost, but the sort of resonance, the historical memory of that militancy sustained itself. And once we got into the teeth of the Depression, but what the John L. Lewis and some of the other founders of the CIO figured out was the AFL doesn't have this right. We can actually organize what's called wall-to-wall in manufacturing companies. We can organize across steel, across auto, across electric companies, across rubber. We can do that. And a very crucial thing was there was this cadre, because we are, of course, in the in some ways some of the high point of both socialism and communism, different sectors of the world leftist movements in the United States. Socialism actually was much weaker then than it was in the early 1900s, but communism reached its apex in the 1930s, and that was a cadre of ideologically driven organizers and staff members who said, yes, we're going to organize unions because that's what leftists do, organize unions. Now, sometimes the CP, the Moscow connection wasn't so great, and, there were contradictions, let's say, which I just touch on briefly in my piece in the Nation during the World War II years. But I think that cadre, you talked to Alexis before about, obviously DSA. I think that cadre is very important. In other words, just to have some people who frankly are doing this because they don't necessarily benefit all that much from it themselves materially, or even their own benefit from it if they're workers, isn't that great? Or they don't think about it that much. Well, let me step back. Their own benefit materially may well be important.
Sure.
They're doing it also for ideological reasons. And that was the difference between now and then is workers are doing that today. It's kind of new laborist segment. I mean, basically guys your age and women who are like, have quote unquote good educations, are not blue collar workers, as they used to be called, or manufacturing workers, but are workers coming out of the Great Recession of 10 years ago and saying, we're getting screwed too. They become radicalized. And what they're doing is they're not organizing auto plants because that's frankly anachronistic now. They're organizing online, media companies. Right. They're organizing as graduate students in their graduate departments at elite, but not only elite universities. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there were a hell of a lot more workers in steel, auto, and rubber and transportation, Teamsters, trucks in the 1930s than there are in internet media companies today. I mean, that's, so in other words, this is really good. I mean, it's sort of like it culturally reproduces the ideology of labor. It's sort of what we're doing right here, right now. We're culturally reproducing the ideology of labor. That's good. It's good for those individual shops, whether it's Vox or the New Republic or, there's dozens of them now, or whether it's the graduate students at Brown or Columbia. That's all good. But when you organize steel, rubber, trucks, and railroads were already organized in mid-century America, you had leverage in the quote unquote commanding heights of the economy, and that was the difference. They were able. The leverage they had then was a huge deal.
So that makes a lot of sense. The economy is different. The leverage was different. But for today, lessons to take away for today, it strikes me a couple things. One, the Great Depression, the war, that was a shared reality. And the crisis we have today the crisis we have today is just as shared and real with climate change, with inequality. It's just as existential in so many ways, but it's an epistemological problem because, especially on the right, there's not an acknowledgement of that reality. But with the right leadership and power in government, right? The new Green Deal could do the same thing for unions, it seems to me, in terms of getting into full employment, in terms of addressing clean energy, in terms of making as urgent the response that the New Deal was to those crises back then, as the response could be now to the crises we have now. And I think that this ties into what you're saying about the need for ideology and radicalizing the left generally, but maybe unions in particular, because the tactical responses that Ryan was speaking to seem to me to be based upon that kind of material interest focus of myself, my family, my union, rather than seeing strategically, because I think that the difference between tactics and strategy is tied to vision, which is probably tied to a broader theoretical understanding, right? And once you understand that your freedom and equality is bound up with everyone else's, right? Then you can make those strategic moves, and then you can have the power of that interconnected strategic push, I think.
Well, let me say this. Let me just back up and just say a word for the difficulty of, I know you're not going to be too sympathetic, but for the difficulty of being a union officer or a union president. Remember I made the comparison, and I was being pretty serious between, independent contractors, which leftists almost always are, not always, as we see now with these organizing of their shops by this new laborist cadre. But when you're at the top, I've been in a room with these guys. And, I don't want to say the job sucks because, they don't get paid anything close to the corporate guys, but they make a good living, and, they're not, even the ones who used to work as shitty jobs like, mining coal or, in a steel mill or something. Well, they're not doing it anymore. And, it's an office job, but just sort of figuring out where to put those chips, as Ryan said, And yes, the fear, if I put them in the wrong place, we could be really screwed. Yes, you're screwed now, so just go for it. You'd think it would be the obvious thing, but they're trying to balance, they're trying to balance like being an employer to lots of staff, and obviously an institution with, hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions of members. Still millions of members. And, there's no obvious route. There were, back in the old days, there were sort of some obvious moves when they had more power. Now it seems like, there are good guesses. There are good estimates. There were just, hell, go for it. Put in your chips. But it's tough to sort of say, okay, I am going to go for it. And, the risk may be severe for my membership, but I'm going to go for it. I'm saying, sure, they have to do it, or the way it must happen inevitably is the rank and file may have to push them to do it. So there's going to have to be workers who sort of get on the street and say, we want you as institutions to do more. Now, to get back quickly to the Green New Deal, the difference, and, it's both a profound one, an obvious one, and a frustrating one because it leads to a collective action problem. The difference between the Green New Deal and, say, the Depression, or even, fighting the war against fascism, is that the danger is being presaged. It's being anticipated by, melting, melting parts of the polar ice cap, or constant hurricanes and all that. But it's not as concrete and immediate as,
not yet.
25 or 30%. Not yet. Right. Not yet. But that not yet, there's a lot of weight in that. See, it's not enough to just argue cognitively it's going to get worse. For most people, they can't really, I'm not talking about politically activist people. I'm talking about most people. who just sort of go through their days. They can't quite grasp making the sacrifices which they may have to make in terms of just spending more money on different kinds of energy and using less of it now that they need to make. And, if Dave Roberts at Vox, who's, obviously one of the most knowledgeable journalists in this area, is right, and the Green New Deal analysts are right, we have to totally decarbonize in 30 years and do like a massive interconnected international job of decarbonizing. That's just us decarbonizing, I guess, in 30 years. Now, I'm for that. I want that to happen. But I'm saying that's a harder sell than telling people they were getting hosed in 1933 when they were sleeping on the street and their clothes was in a box. That's that now. And of course, the grim irony and the paradox may be that by the time it's oh my God, gee, that's Miami. It's that was Miami. It's under 6 feet of water. It might be, then it might be too late. But that's a hard sell.
Well, that's it for the first part of our interview with Rich Yeselson. Stay tuned for part 2, which will be coming up very shortly, where we'll talk about varieties of left-wing ideology. Take care.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.